Lena's house sat on the edge of the high plains, where the vast, rolling hills met the rugged rise of the mountains. The landscape was a patchwork of dry creek beds, winding aimlessly, etched into the earth like forgotten veins. Here and there, large boulders jutted out from the earth, their weather-bleached surfaces mottled with patches of lichen in shades of green and ochre. Low brush and sage also carpeted the land, with silvery leaves glinting in the warm light of the afternoon. It was a quiet, solitary place, but Lena liked it that way. After long days at work in town, she craved the stillness of the plains, a chance to leave the noise of daily life behind and immerse herself in the rhythm of nature. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting a golden glow across the landscape. When Lena stepped out of her house for her daily walk, the crisp air carried the faint scent of sage. She had no particular destination in mind. She never did. Her walks were aimless, following the natural contours of the land as they unfolded before her. She often let her instincts guide her, sometimes venturing toward the shadow of the mountains, other times sticking to the rolling hills, where the plains seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. During these walks, Lena often stumbled upon treasures left behind by nature. A hawk feather caught in the brush, the delicate remains of a blue jay's nest tucked in a low branch, or the glittering facets of a crystal half buried in the dry creek bed. Once, to her amazement, she found a 5-point antler shed from an elk, its surface polished smooth by the elements. These discoveries felt like gifts from the land, tokens of its beautiful, untamed spirit. Here, surrounded by the wide open plains and the endless sky, Lena felt most like herself. Free, untethered, and deeply connected to nature. She could let go of the stresses of the day, the endless demands of work, and the pressure of expectations. The afternoon stretched lazily onward, the sun's light holding steady as Lena walked farther into the hills. The land seemed peaceful, yet a faint, imperceptible awareness lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She paused momentarily, glancing back towards her house in the distance, the rolling plains spreading endlessly behind it. This afternoon, Lena felt drawn toward the dirt road that marked the boundary of the Tall Horse Memorial Site, a sacred preserve owned by the Cheyenne Nation. The site stretched across the meeting place of the high plains and the mountains. Lena had walked near this place many times, always with a sense of respect. The land was sacred, alive with the spirit of the Cheyenne people and their enduring connection to it. The road wasn't much of a road at all. Its surface was grooved with deep ridges of a washboard pattern, making it impassable for most vehicles. Even on foot, Lena found the gravel uneven, requiring careful steps. But she didn't mind. The roughness seemed to mirror the wild beauty of the land it bordered and kept most people away. On one side of the road, the high plains stretched endlessly, golden grasses shimmering under the warmth of the afternoon sun. On the other, the landscape shifted subtly but profoundly. The grasses grew taller and richer, as if nourished by something deeper than the soil. The Tall Horse Memorial Site was more than a place. It was a living testament to the resilience, culture, and traditions of the Cheyenne people. Every summer, the site became a vibrant center of community as tribes from the region gathered for the annual powwow. Even now, in its quiet, Lena could remember and recall the distant rhythm of drums and feel the energy of the celebrations. She'd attended the powwow once years ago as a guest. The memory still glowed in her mind like a rare treasure. The night had been filled with drumming. Dancers moved in mesmerizing rhythm. Men in headdresses with flowing feathers stepped with strength and grace. Their clothing, a kaleidoscope of color and craftsmanship. Children joined in too, their joy infectious as they danced alongside their elders, weaving their own energy into the night. There were no fires, only the glow of the stars above and the light of the people themselves. The powwow had stretched long into the night, a celebration of life, tradition, and resilience that Lena felt honored to witness. She'd never crossed the boundary since, understanding that the land belonged to a world she could only glimpse from the outside. Today, she stayed on the washboard road, her gaze drifting toward the hillside within the preserve. A band of wild horses grazed there, their presence as timeless as the land. Protected by the Cheyenne, the Mustangs were as much a part of the land as the grasses and the trees. They moved together, effortlessly, their coats gleaming in the sunlight in shades of chestnut, grey, and black. The stallion stood apart, his muscular frame silhouetted against the rising mountains, his long mane rippling in the wind. Locals often spoke of the horses with reverence, calling them guardians of the sacred land. Lena paused, her gaze lingering on the horses as they moved across the hillside. A weathered fence line of posts connected with rusty wire marked the site's boundary. A small sign nailed to one of the posts read, "Tall Horse Memorial Site, Sacred Land. Respect and protect." For a moment, Lena stood still, letting the sacred energy of the place surround her. She felt small in the best way, a visitor in a timeless world where the land and its people were inextricably bound. Eventually she turned back, her boots crunching against the grooved surface of the road. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the plains as Lena continued her walk. The washboard road stretched behind her, fading into the rolling hills. She felt the pull of the landscape, as though it wanted her to keep going, to let her steps wander where they would. The land seemed alive, the wind whispering through the sagebrush with a voice she couldn't quite decipher. She veered off her usual path, drawn toward a low ridge rising to the east. The climb was gentle. Rocks scattered along the trail gleamed faintly in the sunlight, their surfaces flecked with mica that sparkled like tiny stars. When she reached the top of the ridge, she paused to take in the scene. The plains were bathed in light that softened the edges of the landscape. Lena could still see the wild horses grazing far below from this vantage point. She sat on a large, flat stone, allowing the peace of the place to settle over her. The land was quiet, but not silent. The wind carried a faint hum, a subtle sound that somehow felt like the echo of something ancient, something older than memory. As the sun dipped lower, she stood and began to make her way back down the trail. The air felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the land was holding its breath. The stillness wasn't unsettling exactly. It was more like a presence, something unseen but deeply felt. Halfway down the slope, Lena noticed a figure standing near the dry creek bed at the base of the ridge. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, or perhaps one of the cottonwoods casting an unusual shape. But as she drew closer, she saw it was a man. He stood motionless, his back to her, wearing clothing that seemed oddly out of place. His coat was long and dark, with a wide brim hat. He looked like he belonged to another time. "Hello," Lena called, her voice carrying softly on the breeze. The man didn't turn, didn't move, as though he hadn't heard her. She stopped walking, her heart beginning to race. Something about him, his stillness, the way he seemed to absorb the light around him, made her hesitate. Summoning her courage, she took another step forward. As her boot crunched against the gravel, the figure turned slightly, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of the side of his face. His features were sharp and weathered, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for a moment, and Lena felt a jolt of something she couldn't name. Perhaps recognition, though she was sure she'd never seen him before. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. Lena blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The creek bed was empty, the man nowhere to be seen. She spun around, scanning the ridge, the hills, the road. Nothing. It was as if he'd melted into the air itself. The stillness pressed down on her now, no longer comforting, but charged with an energy she didn't understand. The breeze stirred again, rustling the sagebrush, and Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know who or what she'd seen, but she was sure of one thing. He wasn't of her world. Her thoughts raced as she tried to steady her breathing. The man had appeared so suddenly, so impossibly, as though conjured by the land itself. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was tied to this place, a shadow of its long and complicated past. This land was also steeped in other stories, whispered warnings, passed down through generations. Not far from where she stood was the site of the Lone Star Ranch, a name that still lingered in local lore like a ghost itself. Built in the late 1800s, Lone Star Ranch was one of the largest homesteads in the area, sprawling defiantly across the plains near the Cheyenne boundary. The ranchers claimed the land as their own, ignoring the warnings of the Cheyenne elders, who told them it was sacred and should remain undisturbed. In 1921, a mysterious fire swept through, consuming the ranch in a single night. The flames were said to have been visible from miles away. No one survived. Locals debated the cause of the fire. Some believed it was retribution, vengeance for the rancher's arrogance. Others whispered about a curse, the land rejecting the settlers and reclaiming itself in fire. Now, nothing remained of Lone Star Ranch but its memory. The land bore no visible scars, but its reputation endured. Locals avoided the area, claiming it was haunted. Shadows were said to move across the plains. Strange lights flickered at night, and ghostly figures were rumored to wander the fields. Lena exhaled slowly, her pulse still pounding in her ears. She'd heard these stories countless times, tales dismissed as exaggerations or superstitions. But after what she'd just seen, she wasn't so sure anymore. The man's image lingered in her mind. The long coat, the shadowy face, the way he seemed to absorb the light around him. She wondered if he'd been connected to the ranch. Perhaps one of the lost souls bound to this place by its tragic history. As she returned along the trail, her steps were unsteady, and unease coiled in her chest. The light was softening now, angling lower as shadows stretched across the hills. She glanced toward the band of mustangs grazing peacefully in the distance. Suddenly, the stallion raised his head sharply, his ears pinned forward. Within seconds, the herd followed suit, their heads snapping up in unison. Without warning, the stallion snorted loudly and bolted, leading the herd in a gallop toward the hills. Their strides churned up dust clouds as they disappeared into the distance. Lena stopped, her heart hammering. The horses hadn't just moved, they'd fled, as if they'd seen or sensed something she couldn't. The stillness that followed was suffocating. The empty plains, eerily quiet after their departure. A chill crept down Lena's spine as she stood frozen. A sensation of being watched, growing heavier. She forced herself to keep walking, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A prickling sensation at the back of her neck that made her glance over her shoulder more than once. The land seemed unchanged, yet something about it felt altered, as if an unseen presence moved within its folds, just out of sight. The trail dipped again slightly, revealing another dry creek bed below. Lena paused, her breath catching as her gaze swept the terrain. The quiet was so absolute that it seemed unnatural. That's when she saw him again. He stood in the creek bed, his figure unmistakable this time, stark and solid against the muted tones of the dusty earth. The man was more distinct now, his presence less like a fleeting shadow and more like a tangible part of the landscape. His long grey hair, streaked with white and silver, hung unevenly around his shoulders. As he turned slightly toward her, his face came into focus. The brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. His skin was deeply tanned and wrinkled, etched by years spent under the unforgiving sun of the high plains, giving him the appearance of someone who'd lived through more than one lifetime. But what struck Lena most was his leg, or rather, the lack of one. His left leg ended abruptly, replaced by a wooden prosthetic. A crutch rested under his arm. His coat was long and tattered, its fabric patched in places with mismatched material. It hung loosely over his thin frame. His stance was steady, but rooted, as though he belonged to the creek bed as much as the rocks and dry earth beneath him. Lena's eyes locked on his. She thought they glinted, not with light, but with something deeper, as if they held the weight of countless stories the land had long buried. The connection struck her like a physical force, a jolt of recognition she couldn't place. A wave of emotion surged through her. Fear, curiosity, and something she could only describe as sorrow. A grief that felt as old as the hills themselves. Her legs felt locked in place, rooted by the intensity of the moment. It wasn't just his eyes holding her. It was the air around her, pressing down with the unbearable sensation of being seen, truly seen. The battle between her instinct to run and the inexplicable pull to stay raged within her, leaving her frozen. Lena's chest heaved as she forced herself to breathe, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The man shifted, his crutch sinking slightly into the gravel of the creek bed as he leaned forward. His movements were deliberate, almost like he wasn't just standing, but waiting for her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. The words seemed small and fragile. The man didn't answer. His gaze held her for a heartbeat longer, and then all his features seemed to shimmer, distorting as if he were caught in a mirage. Then he disappeared. The creek bed was empty again. The rocks and the dry earth undisturbed, as though he'd never been there. Lena stumbled back, her heart beating so hard it felt like it might burst. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing to understand what she'd seen. This time, it wasn't just a fleeting glimpse or a trick of the light. He'd been there, standing before her, every detail vivid and real. Her gaze lingered on the spot where he'd stood, the air still heavy with the energy of his presence. Forcing her legs to move, she retraced her steps. And as she walked, the familiar curve of the landscape brought her to a fork she hadn't noticed before. An alternate path that veered away from the creek bed and the place where the man had appeared. Her chest tightened again as she glanced at the sky. The sun dipping even lower on the horizon. She hesitated only a moment before turning onto the longer trail, knowing she couldn't bring herself to face whatever might linger on the other path. The trail wound through the rolling hills, its rocky path twisting gently between clusters of sagebrush, scrub oak, and scattered boulders. Lena's legs felt heavy, the fear and the tension from earlier still weighing on her. The late afternoon light deepened into amber and purple as the sun slipped lower, casting the land in a soft, fading glow. The unease lingered, tethered to her like a shadow, as the world around her softened into twilight. The man's face stayed in her mind. His gaze held her the most. The way it had pierced through her, not with malice, but with a weight that felt ancient. He wasn't a fleeting apparition. He was part of the land, as real and undeniable as the sagebrush and the rolling plains. As Lena walked, her fear ebbed, replaced by a quiet certainty. What she'd seen couldn't be dismissed. It was proof of something beyond. Death wasn't an ending, but a transformation. An extension of life she could feel, but not explain. She paused at the crest of a hill as the first stars began to flicker in the vast evening sky. The ghost, though frightening, had reaffirmed what she'd always believed, but never fully understood. That life and death were not separate, but connected. The boundary between them was thin and permeable, and his presence was evidence of an unseen world that stretched far beyond her understanding. The trail went on, weaving through the hills as the light faded. By the time Lena reached the final rise and saw the silhouette of her house, night had begun to settle. The stars were brighter now, scattered across the vast dome of the plains, their light, faint but steady. The land seemed calm again, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The man was now etched into her memory as deeply as the patterns of the land she loved. As she stepped onto her porch and opened the door, the cool evening air followed her inside. Lena exhaled, the tension in her chest finally releasing as she let the silence of her home wrap around her. The encounter had shaken her. Yes, it had. But it had also left her with a profound sense of wonder. The land wasn't just alive with the present. It carried the echoes of the past and the promise of something beyond. As Lena turned on the lamp, she knew the memory of this day would stay with her, as vivid and lasting as the endless plains under the night sky.